Hi, I'm Alexandra Kitka, and this is Ergo. One of the defining aspects of a culture is the food its people consume. Many a friend I have made after sharing a bowl of mac and cheese or a plate of pita and hummus. If you're new to this podcast, my name is Alexandra Kitka, and I, along with my executive producer, Quinna Carty, created this podcast with the idea that it would bring together different amazing individuals to share their passions and conversations about practically anything. But apart from the media, I think what has the most potential to bring people together or divide them the most is food. Today I am joined by Salome Bustamante, a woman who I have enjoyed entering into conversation with, whether that be about art, philosophy, or Freud. Hello, Salome.
Hi, Alexandra. How are you?
I'm good. As you might have guessed, the conversation today revolves around the role of food in culture and history. How does the food we eat define us, change us, or perhaps divide us? Are we what we eat? And what does this mean when we study history or experiment in our kitchen? I think it might first be beneficial to speak a little to our own experience with food, whether that be on a personal or cultural basis. For me, I'm primarily Italian American, which means my culture is heavily defined by the food my family eats when we're all together. We often bond over remembering my grandfather's ricotta cheesecake, and we share stories over full stomachs of sausage and tomato sauce.
My mother's Colombian and my father's Egyptian, but I have very little connection to my Arabic roots. But I've actually discovered Arabic, Mediterranean, and just in general Middle Eastern food on my own, but that's later. More about that later. And I think, so growing up, I grew up with my mom and in a Colombian family, and there's very like traditional dishes that we would eat, but I didn't on a day to day basis. Um, I would actually order takeout every day. So my mom doesn't cook. She doesn't know how to cook. She doesn't want to cook. So I grew up on takeout, and I think that was a very interesting experience for me growing up, and it definitely shaped my taste in food. And it also exposed me to just like so many things. Living in Jackson Heights as well in Queens, such a diverse neighborhood and so many different food from so many different places in the world. So that was just like a really interesting experience growing up. Um, and from my Latin background, just Colombian food in general is like this experience of like different taste is really different, all like South American cultures blended together. Um, and there was this one dish that we would make around Christmas time. It's called buñuelos en natilla. And basically, my grandmother would make it. I unfortunately never learned how to make it, but I'd always watch her make it. And they're just little bread balls, I want to say. They're like baked with cheese. Um, and you can put butter on them once they're like done baking, and you fry them a little bit, and they're just amazing. And natija is this coconut flan type thing with a lot of cinnamon, and you eat them together for Christmas, and it's always been like a very traditional thing. So yeah, definitely food for me growing up was just all over the place.
I'm very interested in what you said about your father's side of the family, and you said that you didn't really grow up close to that side at all, but that you did you say you kind of rediscovered that through food?
Yeah, I did. So like I said, I live in Jackson Heights, and right down the block from my house, there's this little halal food truck, and that's like the most generic New Yorker experience ever. Like, you just step on a hot day. Like, what do I want to eat? You're like in the park or whatever. You go and get yourself like a gyro. But for me, like this food truck was just like it always every time you walk by, it just smells fantastic, and it was like, wow, there's like a Bengali man making food. Like, I've actually never like before I actually tried. I was like, I've never actually like tried anything that far away from continental America or like continental South America. So I went over and I was like, hey, like, can I get whatever you want to make me? He was like, what, like this man that spoke very little English. He was like, I don't understand. I was like, make me something. I don't know what I want, but make me something. And he ended up making me this gyro with like falafel, lamb, and this sauce that isn't the generic white sauce that you find, but it's rather more of a minted yogurt type sauce, and it was just absolutely fabulous. And like that was really like my first introduction to like South Asian cuisine. And then that way I segued more into Indian food. I absolutely love Indian food now. And more like Moroccan and Mediterranean food.
What is your favorite food?
That's a tough one. I think while I really love seafood, I think my favorite food would have to be just like plain old chicken nuggets. I'm sorry.
Keeping it classy.
Yes, always. Pinkies up. But no, I actually discovered this place in the Lower East Side called the Nugget Spot, I believe. The Nugget Spot is absolutely amazing. They make these chicken nuggets that are fried in Captain Crunch cereal. And just like the combination of like the sweet buttery goodness with like a nice little tender chicken ball thing. It's exquisite.
For those who can't see what's happening in this room, our executive producer is nodding profusely and smiling. I think it's really interesting. I think people always ask, like, what's your favorite food? It seems to be, like, a go-to icebreaker.
Yeah.
And so my favorite food is curry, like, all types. Penang curry is probably my favorite, but I don't discriminate. They're all amazing. And, I mean, for me, it was a similar situation in terms of, I also live in Queens, and Queens has, I think, actually, I don't know the exact statistics, but has the most languages spoken anywhere else in the world. And of course that brings food along with it. And like the church that I attend is very, very culturally diverse. And we would always have like international food days where everyone is bringing different kinds of food. And Korean, Indian food in general, and like from that region of the world is just, oh my goodness, the spices is just, it's amazing.
Spices, absolutely.
But it's very interesting to me that people kind of connect food and like what your favorite food is or the food of your culture with your identity.
In elementary school, there was always like that sad story that I think like your teacher always started off some unit of like culture with about like the kid bringing food that like just really that kids think smell bad, you know? And that to me, like, growing up was, like, such a heartbreaking story at times because food is really a representation of your country's resources, really. Because you eat with what you can find. And it's that way for, like, coastal countries and coastal places in general. It's, like, it's always been fish. Anything that you can find in the ocean. And then, like, you go anywhere, like, that's more inland and, like, the Midwest, and then you see lots of grain. And I definitely do think that food is an extreme representation of your culture and more so an outlet for your culture. And I think it's just like really great that it's something that we can all bond over, you know?
Yeah, and I think that even if we're thinking not just necessarily on culture lines in terms of our origin, but I mean, I remember in elementary school, there would be kids who would have their cute little packaged lunches that their mother made, with grapes and with cookies. There were the kids who always had Lunchables and you were always jealous of them. And there were the kids who brought in like warm rice and chicken. And I feel like, I don't want to say it divided us, but it at least created these different types of people that there were. There's the kid whose mother does everything for them. There's the kid who's very, very rooted in their culture. There's the kid whose parents forgot to get them breakfast in the morning, and so they stopped at 7-Eleven.
Not Lunchable.
So, I don't know. Do you think that food brings us together, or does it tear us apart?
I just want to touch on something you just said, and I think it will lead me to this. So you mentioned like how the food that these kids bring really like, represents who they are. So I think the food you eat and the food you like comes down to reflect your personality. And I think that in a way, it can do both. It can bring us together and push us apart. About 2 years ago, I was seeing this guy, and he was super into, like, totally loved the most faulty, like, inexpensive, casual walk-in Chinese food. And I'm talking about, like, the Chinese food places, extremely fast food Chinese food places, the corner stores in, like, Bushwick that literally have no little, anyone from Brooklyn knows exactly what I'm talking about. They have no sort of indication that they are a Chinese food place, but everyone is just in a general consensus that they are. And he was just so in love with them. And this is where he always would choose to go out to eat. And I think this is maybe the main reason why it did not work out between us. Because I love variation. I love trying new things, especially when it comes to food. Because, you know, even if you're a person that has a set budget, there's always something that will fit your budget that's way better than, you know, like your normal decision, like McDonald's or like Chinese food even. Maybe even sushi goes into like that category of casualty. But yeah, and that was definitely like a really grand divide for us. I was like, I cannot do this. You have to be equally as much of a foodie as I am, or we can't be together. I'm sorry.
Most of the time, the closest friends I have, like, we're friends because we go out after school and we eat. Like,
Yeah,
that's our go-to hangout.
Yeah, I think it is for most people. Like, we were just talking about Percy's, that $1 pizza place in the Greenwich Village. And our executive producer, Quinn, just kind of just jumped in. It's like, I love that place. Best $1 pizza ever. And I think that's another, like, grand example of how we just, like, found something else that we had in common. And, like, somewhere where we've both been in this mutual experience. Because also just being at that place, like, Percy's is a very specific setup. It's like a little tiny pizza hub. It's like brick walled, and it's beautiful. And it's like super hidden in the Greenwich Village. So just knowing the fact that you share that experience is just like, wow, like we've crossed paths at some point in our lives.
It makes sense if you're thinking about it from a historical and kind of evolutionary way. I mean, food, we literally need food.
To survive,
it's an integral part of survival. And so it kind of makes sense that it would be the thing that kind of brings us together. Because, I mean, if you think about hunter-gatherers living in small groups of people, that's what they did together. They went and they got food. Mm-hmm. And in a way, we're still doing that to this day. We're going out and we're getting food, but perhaps not by the same means.
Yeah, absolutely. Just speaking to that quickly. Also, with the hunter-gatherer society, there was even like the social hierarchy amongst them, and like who was in charge of what. Like the alpha male always went hunting. You know, the alpha male brought back the meat, and you know that integrated in our society today with like you know like the breadwinner. Like who's the breadwinner in the relationship? Who brings home the money, the big bucks, like, and just seeing how like food is so determining of like being able to provide for your family, being a representation of the extent of your wealth or the extent of your knowledge. It's just like how can such a little thing, you know, have such great power, such great meaning.
One thing I love to think about is like the way different foods were invented historically and how they're so connected to like just the means that people had at the time. I mean, one thing I think of is French toast. I love French toast. French toast was invented because poor peasants needed a way to use stale bread. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's all they had. They didn't have the means to go and buy fresh bread every day, so they created French toast, and through the egg and through the cinnamon, they were able to recover into something they could eat. I also think about stew and just the idea of just putting everything in a pot, everything you could find, and I also love stew. And it's really amazing how these things that we look at now as just normal were created because people didn't originally have the means to make better food than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this actually brought up stew, and like I recently started working at this place called Tekoa in Cobble Hill, and it's by this Argentine chef, Alex Raj, and she makes a mix of like Mediterranean and Latin food, and she has this okra stew that's just absolutely amazing. And I tried it the other day, and it just like reminded me of so many different things. So it's like obviously there's okra in it. There's also it's like a tomato soup base. There's eggplant in it, roasted onions, um, and that's really about it. And then it's topped with some yogurt, and just really everything how it came together and how it's all put together. It was just like wow, we just took so many different paths of life, so many different stories about food, and stuck them together in a bowl and called it okra stew. Well, that was kind of bars. Yeah, it was amazing.
You mentioned this connection between like a story and the food that we eat, and it just sometimes there are certain foods or there are certain tastes that kind of bring us back to a certain place or a certain moment in our life. For example, whenever I have like Eastern European food, specifically like chicken with peppers and that kind of flavor. I'm always brought back to this friend I had in elementary school. Every day I would go after school to her house, and her parents cooked like a second lunch, and they would have this big meal right after school. We would sit there, do our homework, watch TV, and just whenever I have that kind of food, it just pulls me back to that time.
Yeah, I think for me, the food that really like grounds me is shepherd's pie. And it's sticky toffee pudding. Oh, sticky toffee pudding is just amazing. But shepherd's pie really reminds me of, I used to have this friend, and we were extremely close, and he actually introduced me to like more British food. And yeah, British food. And I had shepherd's pie for the first time with his family, and shepherd's pie isn't too visually appealing. Like, it's not a dish that you snap a picture of. Absolutely not. But once you bite into it, it's just like so warm. And every time I have shepherd's pie, I remember of like his family and how welcoming they were, as well as how just warm people they were.
In thinking about the other side of food, the idea that food somehow also has the power to divide us, this is kind of funny, but it makes me think of dietary restrictions. People who can't eat certain things either because of choice or maybe they're allergic or have some sort of health problem. Veganism, being gluten-free.
I do think dietary restrictions are a very big dividing point, because it's always so hard to accommodate everyone sometimes. I found that in some instances, dietary restrictions have kind of separated me and my friends. So there was this one time when my friends and I were hunting down vegan pizza because one of my friends is actually dairy free. And he was like, we really wanted to get pizza, and he was just like insisting that we had to get vegan pizza. So we're like, okay. So we like trekked our way to Astoria. I forgot the name of the pizzeria, but we had this vegan pizza, and while it wasn't my favorite thing, it was really interesting to see the way that it was engineered. Like, such a common food was engineered to accommodate someone's necessities. Because, like the cheese they use, like, made with soy instead of, dairy milk. In today's society too, we see a lot of like gluten-free talk, and how a lot of people are usually criticized for being gluten-free, because I don't want to say complicated. It's not a complicated dietary restriction. It's just kind of hard to find all food that is gluten-free. But also with veganism, I feel like you can definitely touch upon this, Alexander. I think you'd find this really interesting. I think that veganism and any sort of like vegetarian pescatarian, any sort of dietary lifestyle that excludes red meat is so subconsciously difficult to uphold, and I truly admire the people that do, because I feel like it's in our DNA. It's one of our like instincts to actually eat red meat because we're predators. We hunt for our food. So I think instinctually we crave meat, and just like being so against it, being able to just totally eliminate this part of their diet is just I don't know. It's just something I admire. I don't know what you think, Alexander, but it's definitely something I respect.
Yeah. I read this article, and I don't remember anything about it except for what it was about. And it, like, I don't know if I agree with this idea at all, but it was just an interesting thing to point out. And the article was looking at the emergence of veganism, but also the emergence of feminism at the same time.
Really?
And it was talking
What's the correlation?
So they were talking just in terms of, evolutionary science and kind of thinking about it like this. And in hunter-gatherer society, like our ancestors, the men were the ones who brought home the meat, and the women were the ones who got the vegetables and went out and got they gathered, and
Right.
the men were the hunters. And so the article was bringing up this idea that I think is a little, I don't know, it might be a little reach, but it's definitely something that's kind of unique and interesting. And the idea was that with like this new wave of feminism, veganism kind of sprung out of that, and the idea that you need to rely less on the hunters of society.
Oh my god, that's so funny. That's definitely a correlation I did not even think of. That's actually really peculiar. So another contemporary issue that I've also noticed, along with like obviously women's rights and the feminist movement that's going on right now, is also the animal movement, and animal rights. And I think that it's very interesting to see how that plays into our food, because also I think that's one of the main reasons why vegans decide to go vegan, and so do vegetarians, because they recognize the inhumane treatment of animals and they don't necessarily agree with it. And I don't think anyone really does, but a lot of us don't have the willpower to really do that. But I think in terms of animal rights, what's going on right now is something really important to recognize, and it is the quality of our food, because I think that ties into with animal rights, the fact that we're torturing literally the things we consume in such a way kind of makes me think that we're torturing ourselves and torturing our body, because if you don't treat well what you're putting in, what you get out is not going to yield any better results.
Yeah, I've also read in a few places about the just the meat industry and how they have like a huge impact on the environment, and specifically global warming. And I don't really know exactly the science behind it, but it's the idea that there's a lot of waste in the meat industry, and specifically in terms of energy, a lot goes to waste. I mean, think about it. We were talking a lot about like the hunter-gatherer times, and one thing that I always remember about that time period is that they used everything. You know, if you were able to hunt and get some sort of animal, you used every single thing you can find on that animal. But that's not the case now. We only use the parts that are good, the parts that we like to eat the most. And that has a lot of waste and has
Absolutely.
a huge impact on our environment. But at the same time, thinking about veganism, I actually went vegetarian for a week. I had a deal.
So did I.
I made a deal with one of my friends, and it doesn't really matter what that deal is, but I went vegetarian for a week, and it was a terrible week. Not even in terms of the fact that I couldn't eat meat, but the more interesting thing that I found about it was because I didn't have this like substantial protein in my diet, and I didn't have this meat.
Weaker.
I felt weaker, but I also ate terribly.
Yeah.
I didn't have that, so I was filling up on just terrible, crappy food.
Because then that also like leads back to economics, because the easier it is to manufacture something, like for example potato chips cost 50 cents. Like you can literally get 400 calories for 50 cents, and that's kind of like a really monumental thing in today. So for people that have such preferences, or anyone really that is not as fortunate to really buy extremely quality of produce, because produce is very expensive. Like the higher the quality, the more expensive it is. I think it's really interesting that, unfortunately this is the situation. And it is because of how much we waste, and how inefficient we are at making use of what we have. There's actually this Brazilian tribal religion where every part of the animal is used in a way because the animal is sacred. Everything that comes from the earth is very sacred to them. So I saw like in this special where this indigenous peoples was hunting a fish, and just everything, every single part of that fish was used in a different way. The spine and its bones were used as needles later by women to, actually craft clothing and quilts and anything they really needed. And just everything was made use of, and I think that's really beautiful.
And something like veganism is also much harder for people with less resources, not only because of maybe the sticker price and how much it is to get produce, but you have to make the food too.
Oh yeah, that's also cooking.
You need to take time out, and it's harder to make food without meat or without dairy because you have to find other things to replace those. I made zucchini crab cakes once. They were great, actually. I really loved them. Obviously, there was no crab in them, but they took an enormous amount of time. I think the whole process probably took me upwards of 2.5 hours to make these things.
Did you have to bake them?
You baked them, then you fried them, and it was a really long process, and it just made me think about this fact that it's really difficult to make food when you have all these different restrictions. So it's not something that is readily available for people who don't have the time or money to actually live that lifestyle. But just thinking about these different ideas of food and trying to replace different ingredients, specifically in the veganism diet, made me think of just about food innovation in general. I think everywhere we see on Facebook people sharing pictures and videos of just cool new places in different parts of New York City where they make, I don't know, just very strange food innovations.
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to my mind just now was Black Tap. A lot of what food innovation is, too, is really presentation, and how food also becomes this visually appealing thing. And what came to mind was Black Tap. And Black Tap is this just little restaurant. There are actually two locations, one in Chelsea and one in Soho. And Black Tap blew up because of BuzzFeed, actually, about a year ago. And, they just sell, like, your generic wholesome American meals, your burger and fries. But what really drew people's attention to them was their over-the-top milkshakes. Their milkshakes are absolutely beautiful to look at. Not only are they delicious, but they're just works of art. And this also kind of made me think about social media and the way that food is promoted through social media. Now, in terms of, like, BuzzFeed food is actually a thing, And I don't know if you guys know, like, Tipsy Bartender on Facebook. Mine is, like, The Alcohol. He very much makes very interesting recipes on drinks, and like all based on just his own creativity and how he sees flavors blending together. And I think social media has been a big factor in advertising several things, but I feel like something that like hits close to home is really food. And when you combine like such a large media outlet with something so personal as food, you get this like really interesting mix of people that like are just flat out like, let's go to this restaurant, we gotta do it, we gotta do this recipe, or people are just like, oh, like I'm not really interested in that.
In terms of food innovations, I think that bringing up social media is very important because social media is all about presentation, and I think that food really has changed over time in terms of culture because of social media. I was talking about stew before, and stew is not the most visually appealing thing to look at. But it was necessity, and during that time, it was more about what could you make, what could you create with what you have. Then I think it kind of transitioned to what does it taste like, and I think that now to an extent we're like focused on what does it look like, or what are they trying to do? What kind of radical moves are they doing? I think that some of the most successful food innovations have been when they combine different things that people like separately and they try to put them together, which can end up terribly sometimes, but also end up amazing. Have you ever had like those milk and cookie shots? So people have combined, they've fused together these two things that people love, cookies, you think of childhood and you think of that warm comfort of home, but then they fuse it together with the idea of alcohol or of drinking culture.
Taking a shot, yeah.
Taking a shot. And so milk and cookie shots, basically the shot glass is made out of a cookie and you have milk in it, and I don't know, they're really good. You should go check them out. But it just made me think of this idea of just bringing together different aspects of our culture and kind of uniting them in food.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite fused dishes these days, it's actually a dessert. I forget where, but in the Upper West Side, there's this really cute store. It's just literally all pink. Inside, it's just like the pinkest, girliest store ever. But they sell this ice cream it's yogurt flavored ice cream, which I know sounds weird because why not just simply use yogurt? But I think that's like the appeal of it. So it literally just tastes like your generic, like, what is it, vanilla yogurt. And then it's infused with, okay, this is going to take some explaining because it's a very specific thing that they do with this ice cream. So, Frosted Flakes. You guys know at the bottom of the cereal box, the very refined down Frosted Flake crumbs, the remainder of it. So, it tastes like that, like sugary goodness at the bottom. Basically, the ice cream is flavored like yogurt, and then it's infused with this taste, and then it's topped with Frosted Flakes. And it's just like bringing back. It's supposed to mimic actually the Frosted Flakes granola bars that came out. About a year ago, and our executive producer was kind enough to look up the name of this place. It's Momofuku for all of you that are interested in showing it. It's a beautiful place. Great desserts. And it actually mimics this granola bar that Kellogg's brought out back in like 2005, I think. That was this cereal bar. They also did it for like, what is it, Captain Crunch. They also did it for Fruity Pebbles. This one just so happened to be the Frosted Flake one. And it's such a big part of so many kids' childhoods that now the shop Momofuku turned it into an ice cream and just made it into like this spectacular, great, unique thing.
Another innovation that comes to mind, and this is less about presentation and more about just how food is made, is the idea of genetically modified organisms.
You know, the first thing that comes to mind is really anything seedless nowadays, because what even is that? So grapes. I feel like when I eat a seedless grape, I'm just all sorts of confused. Like, what exactly am I eating? And it's it's a little scary how we've genetically modified, genetically altered something so natural as a grape and taken all the, I want to say, normal parts of it. Like grapes sexually reproduce, grapes have seeds. We've taken all aspects of it and then graft them for a purpose. We've crafted something entirely for a purpose. Talking about the grapes now, my mind's kind of trailed off into this book I read recently called Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan. And his first chapter of the book is about apples. And he talks about how these plants, so in his book, I should start with that. So throughout his book, he talks about 4 plants. So apples, marijuana, tulips, and potatoes. And he talks about how each of these plants has somehow became dependent on us for their survival, which is something really interesting that we don't think about every day, because we usually think of us being reliant on the elements for our survival, but rather he brings up this perspective of the elements being reliant on us for their survival. So, apples provide sweetness, tulips provide beauty, marijuana provides intoxication, and potatoes provide survival. And he talks about how these plants have genetically, in themselves, through evolution, formed ways to fulfill our needs. So he starts off with apples. Apples aren't actually sweet. Apples are actually extremely bitter when they grow naturally. apples were grafted. So grafting apples actually began during the second millennium BCE in China. And what grafting is you take a portion of the tree. It's much like a skin graft, where you take a portion of the tree's bark and you quite literally implant it into another tree. Somehow the tree is able to fuse themselves together and produce a totally hybrid breed of whatever it is that those trees produce, in this case, apples. So tree grafting began in China, where these undomesticated apples grew because people realized that they were super bitter, but they grew in such momentous amounts. They were extremely, when they bloomed, there was so many apples, they didn't know what to do with them. Because you can't really consume them. Like an undomesticated apple is kind of gross. They're pretty horrible. So while these people were grafting these trees, so many different variations of the apple arose that some were actually sweet. So once they finally reached that perfect combination, after that they began replanting these trees, began, growing. And the reason this this breed of tree exists is purely based on us. And this was the first example of really, like genetically modifying an organism. It just shows that we've been, for the longest time, I want to say mutilating, really, organisms for our own convenience.
It's interesting to me because one of basically the primary function of any sort of plant is to reproduce and is to survive. And we've kind of taken that away and made it so that these different plants, apples, are dependent on us. It just seems kind of unnatural.
Yeah, a little bit unnatural. And it's really a little bit disappointing sometimes to think that, also back to the economics, that really sometimes the only affordable food for a lot of people is unfortunately food that is covered in pesticides and GMOs, and it takes away the beauty of what cuisine is. Because cuisine is supposed to be something, at least what I think it's supposed to be, is a journey, or rather a representation of what the earth is through taste. Because at the end of the day, everything comes from the earth. Pretty funny quote from last night. And yeah, that leads me into art. Just makes me think about how food is art.
You mentioned briefly the connection between food and just spirituality, the idea that things are coming from the earth. And this just makes me think of the relationship between food and religion. You can think of communion, the idea that you connect with God and you connect with these higher beings through food and through consuming bread and wine. I also think of, we were talking before about dietary restrictions. A lot of people have these restrictions because of their religion. They eat halal because they believe that that's what God told them to do, or they adhere to the kashrut dietary laws because that's what the Torah tells them to. And it's very interesting to me, especially considering the idea that food is so important in our culture, that it's also so important in religion. What we consume is directly correlated to what we believe is happening in the world at its very foundations.
Yeah, or more of what is happening in our world. Something that I've always found really interesting is this concept of alcohol being prohibited in a halal diet. And that goes back to the fact that anywhere where really you can think of where halal diets are embodied, which is like South Asia, the Middle East, parts of the Mediterranean, several different parts. What's abundant in all these places is fruit. And what happens is that when fruit grows and ripens and then begins to decay, it becomes alcoholic, actually. There's an increase in ethanol in the food. And then people were consuming these fruits and they realized that they're getting intoxicated from them, but in a in the best way possible. And I just think that it's really interesting how, because of this like origin and this natural process of food, um, a lot of people with the, this halal preference of lifestyle have evolved to entirely exclude that natural part of the earth. So it's interesting what like we pick and choose, and how we're selective and why we're selective and how that affects us.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, you have a story like Jesus turning water into wine, where you have completely on the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of alcohol consumption. Someone who is claiming to be God actually making wine, making alcohol, and if you've ever heard this story, perhaps in Sunday school for people who have done that, it's supposed to show the glory of God. And when you think about alcohol and how alcohol is so connected to pleasure and to people enjoying life, it's very interesting to me how that can also be looked at on like a spiritual basis.
Yeah, I've had a very tangent thought, but I think it's very important to this. Not so much religious, but definitely somewhat related to Christianity and Catholicism. The idea of Santa Claus and how, commercially, traditionally, we leave cookies out for Santa Claus and milk. And you mentioned earlier that's that's a symbol. It is the symbol of childhood. And, it's when you're a kid, Santa Claus is something you truly believe in. And I think this embodiment of childhood being represented in cookies and, kind of sacrificing it or like leaving it there as tribute to someone you praise, somewhat like a god, Santa Claus, when you're little. It's just interesting how food has become, or has always actually been, such a big source of pleasure that we feel like it's important to sacrifice it sometimes.
I think it's amazing how humans have taken this thing that just provides us the foundation of life and have transformed it into something that is meant to transcend life itself.
Yeah.
And so with that, I just want to kind of pose this ending question. Is food an art? Is cooking an art?
Oh, absolutely. The process of food and cooking itself to me is absolutely an art, because I really do view it like painting, for example. The process starts in your mind, and you think about an idea and you envision what flavors, what colors, what consistencies you want to put out on a dish. And you really engineer the craft or your piece, all in your mind. And then you look to Mother Nature for your tools. You look for ingredients, the right flavors, the right textures. And these are all very important parts of cuisine, I feel like, because when one is off, the entire dish is off. Your vision is totally ruined. And then, so once you've gathered your right tools, you go on to the execution. And there's a lot of chemistry that goes into it, about like in what way do you want to manipulate the ingredients, whether you want to heat them up or do you want to ice them, do you want to leave them as they are? Because, you don't really think about it, but something that might taste a certain way cold is entirely different hot. And then, once you've finished your execution, it's about display. How do you want people to view your dish? And then you have a work of art, because you've not only produced something that you've made, but you've been able to encompass what you envisioned in this dish and then impacted your receiver in such a way. And I think that in itself is a definition of art.
Well, that's all we have for today. A big thank you to Salome for joining us in conversation today.
Absolutely, Alexandra. Thank you so much for having me. And if you guys are ever around Cobble Hill, and are interested in some really bomb Mediterranean Latin cuisine. You can stop by Tekawa, 264 Clinton Street. Alex Raj is a fantastic chef. And, you know, any foodies out there like me, I think you guys would really love it.
Also, a big thank you to our executive producer, Quinn Accardi, for the production of this episode. Don't forget to follow us on social media. It's Ergo Podcast pretty much everywhere. You can also check out my website. That's alexandrakitka.com, alexandrakytka.com. Don't forget to tune in next time. Remember, we're available on iTunes and SoundCloud. Thanks.